My name's Francis Maude. I was the Minister for the Cabinet Office and Paymaster General from 2010 to 2015.
We're talking about digital governance and how successful the UK has been. What would you say has been so successful about the UK's approach to digital governance?
Well, I remember years ago in Estonia, which was then the world leader in digital government, saying to the then Prime Minister, well, how did tiny Estonia become the world leader? And he said, well, when we became an independent country, we had two advantages. We had no legacy because the Russians had cleaned the place out when they left. And we had no money, so we had to do things differently. So I said, well, look, in Britain, we've created the second of those two conditions. We've run out of money, had a huge budget deficit, but we got a hell of a lot of pretty ugly legacy in terms of government IT projects, expensive, not brilliant, and so we had to do things differently. And we were lucky in that the timing was good, because we were just at one of those inflection points when internet technology was enabling things to be done radically differently. So to get things done at a fraction of the cost. So an end to the old kind of black box mode of procurement, where you go to a big supplier with an enormously prescriptive specification and they expect them to build the whole thing. A world where you can build in a modular way. We can do it ourselves. So we brought some capability back into government that it didn't have. And we hired Mike Bracken, who was brilliant and who put together a superb team of people who were absolutely dedicated, people who could have earned a multiple of what they earned as temporary civil servants, as they could have earned outside, but who were passionate about driving historic change. And they quietly got on and did stuff. And the key thing is quick wins always. Show what you can do. Don't tell the story. Show. And so they built some apps. They particularly within, I think, 9 months, had a public beta of Gov't.uk, which became an award-winning single domain, web domain for the British government, all focused around the needs of the citizen. And it was just a very different way of doing things. And so I think a lot of people in the establishment, the stuffy establishment, kind of thought, well, these are kind of, these aren't very serious people. They're kind of doing a little pretty front-end stuff. And then suddenly they wake up one day and find actually they're doing really serious stuff that's saving a ton of money and improving the experience for citizens and for the users of services enormously.
But I guess for those countries that are looking at the UK and thinking, how do we learn from this? And if you were, as they are in Canada, a pretty new government, what would be your advice? What's the first step on the ladder?
Look at what's going on, stop things happening, stop the madness, stop the self-harm, stop the things which don't make sense, and do it differently, chunk it up. You shouldn't be signing long contracts. You shouldn't be signing big contracts. We had some rules, as we said, no contract with a lifetime cost of more than £100 million, no extensions to contracts, no hosting contract more than 2 years, because with the cost of hosting halving every 18 months, why would you tie yourself into these longer contracts? No systems integrator should be a service provider for that same part of government. You want to separate that out so you know what you're buying. Get more ability to integrate within the government yourself, so you can get comfortable with chunking it up much more. So a very different way of thinking about things and doing things. And then bear in mind, this is not just about technology. In a way, technology is the least important part of it. It's about a completely different way of thinking about how government works and how public services are delivered.
And I mean that's a really important point. I mean, for citizens, what is the end goal? What are they, they want to see government operating in a much more agile way. They want public services, quick, fast delivered. They see this happening in the private sector. So for citizens, why is this not happening?
Well, it is happening now, and it can happen. But governments typically expect people to adapt themselves to the way government happens to be configured. And the way government is configured is a kind of history, an accident of history in a way. So people are expected to conform to how government operates, not the other way around. A commercial business that expected its customers to adapt to how they wanted to operate would go bust. But governments obviously don't go bust in that way because people don't have a choice. So it's incumbent on politicians and civil servants and all of those connected with public services to ensure that we do the difficult thinking about how do we provide services fashioned around the needs of the user and the wishes of the user. And that's a very different way of doing things, a very different way of thinking about things.
So you're talking about a different way of doing things, but as you yourself has pointed out, the culture of government, sometimes it's difficult to change the culture of government overnight. So if you're running a government anywhere in the world and it's the culture that you have to tackle, how do you start to do that? You were Minister for the Civil Service whilst also trying to do all this efficiency and reform. How did you take them with you?
Well, we didn't take everyone with us. I think one of the things we did wrong, which if we had our time again, I think we would have done differently, is have much earlier focus on delivering better technology for civil servants themselves. Because we were doing some difficult things. We were downsizing the civil service by more than 20% over 5 years. We were reforming civil service pensions, still generous, but less generous than they were. We were freezing pay for a period. So you were expecting a smaller civil service to do as much in difficult conditions, and yet we were still expecting them to work with technology that was impossible to use. I mean, I got so frustrated with the technology I was given. When you're in opposition, you become an early adopter of technology because you don't have huge resources, so you use technology. So we all came into government in 2010 kind of used to using email and mobile technology and comfortable with it. And then you suddenly find you're expected to use government technology that was appalling. It was kind of unusable. And civil servants were doing that, using that every day. And so I think if we had our time again, we would have put a big emphasis early on getting better technology and better applications for civil servants themselves, because that would have got a lot more buy-in early on.
Now, you talk about a completely different way of thinking about government. So what do you think is the future? The future of government, the future of citizens and government? How do you envisage it, and what's the potential?
I think the potential is to do things completely differently. I mean, Mike has this vision, which others have talked about. Tim O'Reilly, a great sort of digital guru, has written about this. Government as a platform, where you have single canonical registries of data. Government data is terrible. It sits in different places. The quality is poor. No private company would survive with data that's as bad as government data tends to be. So you have single registers of data which are separate from departments. Common services laid across the top with APIs to enable others to build services off that data in a very controlled way, because obviously concerns with privacy and so on and security are paramount. But you start to do that, and then you change the way government works, because the justification for having all these separate silos which operate in a very self-contained way, that starts to erode, and that's quite an exciting, I think, thing. You would have strong ministerial offices able to draw off this common pool of government and adapt to be much more fleet of foot. If we decide government's structured wrong for current needs, then you have to go through an incredibly elaborate, complicated machinery of government change, because they're all on different email systems and in different places. If you have it much more fluid, you can be much more responsive, and governments are going to need to respond to changing demands in a much speedier and more fleet of foot way. So I think we got a chance to do something very, very different and build a very different way of thinking about government and how it interacts with the citizen.
And if we don't?
Well, government it'll go bad again. I mean, people kept saying to me when we were doing all of this, kind of quite, digital was only just one strand of a whole lot of stuff we were doing, of pretty challenging reform. And people would say, Francis, when's it going to end? And I'd say never, because this is always going to be a work in progress. You know, you're either getting better or you're getting worse. And if you think you're staying the same, believe me, you're getting worse, you're deteriorating. There is no such thing these days as steady state.
So just finally, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or a message to any government listening to this that we haven't had the chance to say yet?
No, my guiding mantra, I realised, was JFDI. Mike Bracken's much more elegant form of that is the strategy is delivery. Get on and do it, and show, don't tell. My version was JFDI. Just do it.
Thank you.